Melancholia is a film that is perpetually concerned with and fundamentally seems to understand the mental state of depression, and uses it as a vehicle for the most coherent theme in the film itself. While depression permeates a major part of Melancholia, it's very clearly not the whole picture. This is an apocalypse film that portrays the end of the world in a very unusual and unique way, a way that one could argue is less literal and more figurative. Every frame, sound, and character is chosen carefully, and von Trier conveys his vision of the apocalypse as a disaster that exists in the physical and the psychological. His dichotomous way of telling his narrative through Part 1 and Part 2 gives the film a beautiful symmetry that highlights the diverse and incredibly layered characters in Melancholia. Immediately as the film begins, we understand as a viewer that von Trier utilizes handheld camera shots extensively, which may seem unusual to the viewer's expectations, but as an audience member, this shot scale intimately involves us with the lives of these characters, and yet there is so much tension between the characters in Part 1 that we immediately feel uncomfortable as an audience member. Justine nor Claire are neither overly likable characters, and with the use of the handheld camera that forces us to interact with them, we feel like we've become part of this silent and ominous psychological apocalypse. Von Trier has been called a brutal filmmaker by his audience before, and the rest of his choices in shot scale reaffirm this idea. Several very long takes result in drawn-out emotion from the characters we are watching, and an uncomfortable, lingering feeling from the audience. Von Trier immerses his audience immediately, simply with his choice of shooting style, with long takes and handhelds, suggesting that something is intrinsically wrong and bizarre within the world of his story. And frankly, there is. Von Trier has a very homogenized color palette, usually utilizing very dull and soft colors, which makes the film have a sort of gloomy effect. Everything at night perpetually feels murky and foggy until the catharsis of the film, when these colors climax into a visual apocalypse in itself. The planet Melancholia is in itself an allegory in color. Its light blue shades and overwhelming presence replicate the idea of melancholy in an almost poetic expression. This shot is taken from the ending of Melancholia. We see a visual catharsis of color. The shades of blue emphasize the association of sadness with the color blue. This visual in itself makes many viewers uncomfortable, and yet this poetic expression gives us a resolution to the dreadful feeling the film conveys. It's no coincidence that everything in Melancholia is a dichotomy. Claire is Justine's character foil, and yet they depend on each other in their strange relationship. In Part 1, Justine is villainized in this relationship. While it's the happiest day of her life, so to speak, she feels entirely apathetic throughout the process. She simply doesn't care about what's happening. Her marriage is unimportant, and so is her family. Her priorities are non-existent, and she cheats on her husband and quits her job. These superficial ideas that everyone around her values suddenly doesn't interest her. She's isolated from all of those ideas and peoples, and she ruins her wedding, and while devastating to her family, Justine knows it doesn't matter. Claire becomes an almost paternal figure to Justine, and takes care of her after Justine's relationship seems to fall apart. In Part 2, however, the dichotomy changes. Suddenly, Justine becomes an almost Christ-like figure. She becomes so apathetic about the apocalypse that her serene attitude almost calms and reassures the people around her, and she becomes the paternal figure who guides Claire through the apocalypse. There is something about Justine in this second part that is inherently romantic and supernatural. Since she embraces emotion to drive her decisions, there is that clear ideological dichotomy, and yet von Trier also plays with the idea of musical dichotomy. The soundtrack very strangely juxtaposes the visuals we see. The grand and almost epic orchestral soundtrack accompanies the calm and creepy composition of each scene. It reminds us that the apocalypse is real, cosmic, and unstoppable in scale. This is how von Trier depicts the doom of our characters and the juxtaposition of ideas, sounds, and colors. This dreadful symphony makes the apocalypse intensely vivid for the viewer, and we live through those effects in a non-diegetic sense. Many viewers comment that they carried the feelings of the apocalypse with them after finishing the film itself. Perhaps the most interesting theme in Melancholia, however, is the idea of the isolated apocalypse. Von Trier subverts the cliches of the genre and takes our apocalypse to an isolated world with only 4 characters. Everyone in the film very ominously leaves one at a time, and in a sense, they are dying. Like many of the tropes we see in other apocalypse films, we lose characters to some elements of the apocalypse, or a self-sacrifice for the greater good, the death of a close friend or ally to impact the audience emotionally. And yet, the characters in Melancholia do not physically die, they just leave. The butler stops showing up to work, and Justine's father doesn't stay the night. Almost all the characters from Part 1 disappear, and we feel almost intrinsically lonely as a viewer with these 4 characters that we're left with. And yet, Von Trier portrays this feeling of isolation in everything he does, from the mise-en-scène of Justine lying naked to Melancholia, to the sounds we hear in each scene, to the rustling of clothes and the clanging of cutlery. Everything is so specific that Von Trier wants us to feel like each scene has a lot of empty space. The madness of this isolated environment is so contrary to what most viewers are used to. Instead, we have this wealthy mansion with a very limited cast of characters. Each action one of the characters does impacts us harder as a result. The limited space and characters make the audience relate to Claire. Von Trier can incite feelings of panic and claustrophobia as we watch these characters endure the end. The irony of the environment is that the more these characters care about wealth and social status, the lonelier they become as a result. None of the characters wish to spend the apocalypse with them, and I found that this had an almost claustrophobic effect on me as a viewer. The death of John was a particular climax in the movie. It completely breaks Claire as she realizes the reality of her situation. And it's particularly interesting that John as a character prided himself on these superficial priorities in life that arguably led to him dying the quickest. It's only when Claire accepts this isolation that she arguably finds peace. In her attempt to leave the mansion, she goes nowhere at all, cementing this claustrophobic loneliness Von Trier embeds in the audience, and eventually accepts her fate by isolating herself more in this small stick house with Leo and Justine. In conclusion, Melancholia does a lot of things hauntingly well. Von Trier really understands what it's like to make the viewer uncomfortable, and make the viewer immersed at the same time. The end of the world is silent and lonely. Indeed, I didn't feel satisfied after watching this film. In fact, I almost felt angry and shook because of the empty and hollow emotion that I felt for the rest of the day. And that is why Melancholia is completely brilliant. Von Trier created Melancholia as a chilling realization of the apocalypse, and how sometimes the end of the world isn't as important to everybody involved.